In the long memory of humanity, there was once an age that seemed without limit, an era when the stars themselves appeared to open like distant gates, and the destiny of mankind felt not only certain, but triumphant. It began after Old Night, after the long isolation of worlds cut apart by warp storms and fear. Across a fractured galaxy, human civilizations had risen, fallen, and forgotten one another. Some had turned inward, clinging to survival. Others had drifted into strained philosophies, divergent evolutions, or silent extinction. The dream of a united species had become little more than myth. Then, on Terra, a single arose above the ruins of history. The being who would come to be known as the Emperor of Mankind did not proclaim himself with spectacle. His authority was not born of ceremony, but of inevitability. In a world scarred by warlords, techno-barbarians, and the last echoes of collapsed empires, he brought unity through unmatched power and a vision that stretched far beyond the cradle of humanity. He did not promise comfort. He promised survival, order, and a future written in the language of the stars. Once Terra was bound under his rule, his gaze turned outward. The Great Crusade began not as an act of conquest alone, but as a vast reclamation. Humanity's lost colonies, scattered across tens of thousands of worlds, were to be found, brought back into compliance, and woven into a single galactic civilization. The Imperium was not yet the rigid, suffocating colossus it would one day become. It was young, expanding, and filled with fierce confidence. At the forefront of this endeavor stood the Legions Astartes, the Space Marines. Forged through genetic mastery and relentless training, they were modern soldiers. They were symbols of a new era, transhuman warriors clad in ceramite and purpose, carrying the Emperor's will to the farthest reaches of the void. Each legion bore its own character, its own traditions, and its own methods of war, yet all were bound by loyalty to the same distant, radiant figure on Terra. Above them all stood the Primarchs, beings of immense intellect, strength, and charisma, created to be exemplars of humanity's potential. Though scattered across the galaxy in their infancy by forces not yet understood, they were rediscovered one by one during the Crusade. Each reunion was a moment of legend, a lost son restored to his father, a general returned to command armies worthy of his design. In these early years, the Imperium moved with astonishing speed. Expeditionary fleets, each a self-contained armada of warships, mechanicum vessels, army regiments, iterators, and colonists, pushed into the unknown. Some world greeted them as saviors, remembering dimly the promise of a wider human family. Others resisted, clinging to independence or twisted ideologies born of long isolation. Compliance was offered in words first, then enforced by bolter and blade when needed. Yet even war, in this age, carried a different tone. There was destruction, yes, cities brought low, tyrants overthrown, alien empires shattered, but all of it was framed within a grand narrative of progress. Each victory was another step toward unity. Each new world added to the Imperium strengthened the belief that humanity's destiny was to rule the galaxy, not as scattered tribes, but as a single, rational civilization guided by reason and secular truth. The Emperor himself rarely appeared on the battlefield in these later years of the Crusade. His presence was distant, almost abstract, fell through orders, doctrines, and the immense machinery of the Imperium that turned according to his design. To most citizens of the growing empire, he was a figure of a glimpsed only through statues, remembrance of art, and the testimonies of those few who had stood in his presence. And yet, his absence did not weaken faith in the mission. It strengthened the mystique. In his stead, the Primarchs became the visible pillars of the Crusade. They were warriors, statesmen, and symbols all at once. Worlds brought into compliance would see them descending from the sky, towering and radiant, embodiments of the Imperium's promise. Their words could end wars before they began. Their anger could erase civilizations in a single campaign. Among them, one rose to particular prominence. Horus, Primarch of the Lunar Wolves, was known for a rare blend of brilliance and warmth. Where some of his brothers were distant or severe, he possessed a charisma that drew both mortals and Astartes into fierce loyalty. His legion fought with precision and ferocity, earning distinction in campaign after campaign. Officers across the expeditionary fleet spoke his name with admiration, and many believed he best embodied the spirit of the Great Crusade, bold, adaptable, and utterly devoted to the Emperor's vision. In time, As the Imperium's borders stretched ever wider, the Emperor made a decision that would echo through history. He withdrew from the front lines of the Crusade and returned to Terra, entrusting overall command of the Great Crusade to Horus, whom he named Warmaster. To the Imperium of that moment, it seemed a natural progression. The Emperor had always been more than a general. He was an architect of destiny. His work, it was said, now required his full attention at the heart of the Empire. Horus, beloved and proven, would lead the Crusade in his stead. The transition was marked by ceremony and celebration, a sign that the Imperium had matured into something enduring, something larger than the constant presence of its creator. Confidence flourished. Across compliant worlds, infrastructure grew at a staggering pace. The mechanicum of Mars spread its forges and knowledge, binding distant systems into networks of industry and supply. Iterators carried the imperial truth, a doctrine that denied gods, superstition, and the old fears of the warp, teaching that humanity's future lay in reason, science, and unity under secular rule. Remembrances chronicled the Crusade's triumphs, filling archives with art and testimony that celebrated a species ascending toward its golden age. To live in this era, on many worlds, was to believe that hardship was temporary, that each generation would see conditions improve, that the darkness between the stars was retreating before the light of human endeavor. Even the warp itself, that turbulent ocean through which imperial ships traveled, seemed a challenge to be mastered rather than a terror to be feared. Navigators plotted ever more ambitious routes. Astropaths stitched together communication across unimaginable distances. The Imperium was learning to move, to speak, to think as a single galactic entity. But beneath the surface of this radiant expansion, subtler currents moved. The Imperium was vast, and growing vaster still. Its lines of communication stretched thin. Compliance, once achieved, did not always mean harmony. Some cultures adopted the imperial truth outwardly while clinging to older beliefs in secret. Some planetary governors ruled with wisdom, others with cruelty that bred quiet resentment. The legions themselves, so powerful and so proud, developed distinct identities that sometimes bordered on rivalry. None of this seemed alarming at the time. Disagreements were natural in any great enterprise. Tensions were expected in a project that spanned the galaxy. The prevailing belief was that strength and loyalty would smooth all fractures, that the Emperor's design was too vast and too carefully wrought to falter. And above all stood Horus, Warmaster of the Imperium, first among the Primarchs in honor and responsibility. His victories continued. His counsels were well attended. His words carried the weight of both friendship and command. To many, he was not merely the Emperor's son, but the living guarantee that the Great Crusade would see its glorious conclusion. The fleet sailed on. New stars were charted. New worlds were brought into the fold. The Imperium, young and untested, believed itself unbreakable. Yet history, in its quiet way, often turns not at the height of triumph, but in the shadow cast by it. The very scale of the Imperium's success created distances of space, of culture, of understanding, that even demigods found difficult to bridge. Decisions made far from terror carried unforeseen consequences. Victories won in the Emperor's name sometimes concealed wounds that did not immediately show. Still, in this early age, such thoughts were distant, like faint stars barely visible at the edge of sight. For now, there was only the steady advance of humanity into the dark, the thunder of engines between the stars, and the shared conviction that this was the dawn of a final, everlasting empire, an age when mankind would never again know the long night of isolation and fear. And so the Great Crusade continued, fleet after fleet vanishing into the void with banners bright and holds full of hope, while on Terra the Emperor labored in silence, and far away the Warmaster carried the dream forward, unaware how fragile even the grandest designs can be. In the vast quiet between worlds, where starlight drifts across ancient dust and the echoes of distant wars fade into memory, the Imperium's golden age glowed at its brightest, serene, confident, and poised upon a future no one yet imagined could ever fall into shadow. With the Emperor withdrawn to Terra, the rhythm of the Great Crusade subtly changed, though few could have named the difference at first. The fleet still traveled onward. Compliance actions were still executed with precision. New worlds still entered the expanding map of human dominion. Yet the center of gravity had shifted, settling now upon the shoulders of one being who had once fought simply as a son among brothers. Horus, newly raised as Warmaster, stood at the head of a war effort that spanned unimaginable distances. His command was not merely symbolic. From flagships that served as traveling capitals, he oversaw strategy, arbitration between legions, and the delicate management of egos as powerful as any weapon in the Imperial arsenal. Where once he had answered only to the Emperor's direct word, he now bore the weight of interpreting that will across a galaxy that grew more complex with every passing year. To the warriors of the Legions Astartes, the change was a point of pride. That one of their own, a Primarch forward for conquest, now directed the crusade affirmed their belief that the Imperium was a merit of strength and loyalty. Horus did not command from distant palaces alone. He remained present at the front, leading assaults, walking among his captains, and listening to the reports of remembrances and iterators alike. This closeness fostered devotion that ran deep and personal. Across the expeditionary fleets, his name became a unifying force. Disputes between commanders were brought before his councils. Rivalries between legions, once sharp, were often softened in his presence, if only temporarily. His ability to balance diplomacy with decisive violence allowed the crusade to maintain its momentum, even as the scale of operations stretched supply lines and patience alike. Yet the burden of such responsibility was immense. Each campaign demanded choices that shaped the fate of entire civilizations. Worlds that resisted compliance sometimes did so out of fear rather than malice, their populations shaped by long isolation and misunderstanding. Horus, like his father, preferred swift submission with minimal destruction, but the realities of war often force harsher outcomes. Every order carried consequences measured not only in territory gained, but in lives irrevocably altered. While the Warmaster navigated these demands, the other Primarchs continued their own conquests. Each carved a legend across the stars, bringing unique methods to the shared cause. Some favored overwhelming force, ending resistance in a single, crushing blow. Others worked through patient diplomacy, integrating worlds with careful reforms. Their successes fed the growing belief that the Imperium's expansion was both inevitable and righteous. Still, beneath the surface of triumph, distance grew. The Emperor's absence, once accepted as a necessity, became a quiet absence that could not be bridged by astropathic messages alone. His sons, created to be generals and governors, had always looked to him as a final authority. Without his direct presence, interpretation replaced certainty. Subtle differences in philosophy, once settled by word from Terra, now lingered unresolved, shaped instead by personality and pride. Horus felt this keenly, though he rarely spoke of it. To question openly would have seemed like weakness, and he would not allow doubt to take root among those who depended on him. Instead, he worked harder, driving himself to be not only a commander, but a symbol of unity. He visited legions beyond his own, honored their traditions, and praised their victories, weaving a fragile cohesion across forces designed for war, not governance. Meanwhile, the Imperium's civilian branches expanded in the Crusade's wake. Administrators followed the fleets, imposing standardized systems of taxation, law, and infrastructure. The Mechanicum established forge worlds that pulsed with industry, binding newly compliant systems into webs of production. Iterators continued their mission to spread the imperial truth, teaching that humanity's destiny lay in reason and the rejection of superstition. On many worlds, this brought stability and progress. On others, it replaced one form of hardship with another. Ancient customs were erased in the name of unity. Local rulers were displaced by imperial officials who understood efficiency better than culture. Compliance ensured order, but not always harmony, and the gap between ideal and reality widened so gradually that it rarely drew immediate alarm. Reports of unrest did reach the Warmaster's councils, though they were often overshadowed by the urgency of fresh campaigns. Rebellions were categorized as isolated incidents. Cultural resistance was framed as a temporary obstacle on the path to enlightenment. The prevailing belief remained unshaken, that time and firm guidance would bring all worlds into alignment with the Imperium's grand design. In quieter moments, as void ships drifted between the stars and the sounds of war fell briefly silent, there were those who wondered how long such momentum could be sustained. The galaxy was vast beyond comprehension, and each victory revealed new frontiers rather than an end in sight. Expansion had become a constant state, leaving little space for reflection or consolidation. Yet such thoughts rarely lingered. The machinery of the crusade allowed no true pause. Orders arrived. Fleets translated into the warp. Another system awaited illumination by the Emperor's vision, carried now through the voice and authority of his Warmaster. And so the Imperium pressed onward, brilliant and unyielding, its banners carried across the void by warriors who believed they were building a future without darkness, even as the sheer scale of their achievement cast shadows too large and too distant for any one of them to fully see. As the Great Crusade advanced ever deeper into the galaxy, the Imperium began to encounter not only lost human worlds, but reflections of humanity's long isolation. Each rediscovered civilization was a fragment of an ancient whole, shaped by environment, memory, and centuries of separation from terror. Some greeted the expeditionary fleets with relief, seeing in the Imperium a return to shared destiny. Others regarded the newcomers with suspicion, their histories filled with cautionary tales of distant tyrants and forgotten wars. Compliance, in these varied circumstances, became as much a matter of interpretation as enforcement. Imperial envoys would descend first, bearing declarations of unity and promises of technological renewal. Iterators spoke of reason, progress, and a future free from fear of the warp's unpredictability. Often this was enough. A planetary ruler, weighing the might displayed in orbit against the benefits of alliance, would bend the knee. Such worlds joined the Imperium with ceremony rather than bloodshed. But not all planets chose this path. Some had developed divergent ideologies that clashed sharply with the imperial truth. Others had been shaped by hostile Xeno's neighbors and saw any off-world force as a threat. On these worlds, negotiations faltered, and the burden passed to the legions of Astartes. War followed, swift and overwhelming. Fortresses fell. Armies broke. Resistance ended beneath the relentless advance of transhuman warriors whose very presence seemed to deny the possibility of defeat. To those who planned the crusade, such actions were regrettable necessities, unfortunate but unavoidable steps toward a greater peace. The Imperium's leaders believed that temporary suffering would give way to lasting stability once integration was complete. Records were kept, losses tallied, and fleets moved on, leaving behind garrisons and administrators to shape compliance into lasting order. Yet memory lingered among conquered populations. Even as infrastructure improved and trade routes opened, there were those who remembered the day the sky burned with descending ships and their old banners were torn down. Gratitude for security existed alongside quiet resentment. The Imperium, vast and confident, rarely saw these small embers of discontent. From the heights of command, each world was a marker on a strategic map, its complexities reduced to reports and production quotas. Within the legions themselves, long campaigns began to carve deeper identities. Fighting side by side forged bonds of brotherhood stronger than steel, but it also reinforced distinctions. Each legion's methods hardened into tradition. Some became renowned for unbreakable discipline, others for ferocity that bordered on artistry in battle. Pride in these identities was encouraged, for it drove excellence. Still, pride carried the faint risk of comparison, and comparison could grow into rivalry. The Primarchs, though united in purpose, felt these currents as well. Each was master of a vast war machine and responsible for the lives of countless warriors. Their achievements were celebrated across the Imperium, their failures noted in private councils. Without the Emperor's daily presence to anchor them, their relationships evolved through shared campaigns, distant correspondence, and occasional tensions that never fully surfaced, yet never entirely faded. Horus, as Warmaster, stood at the intersection of all these forces. Messages flowed constantly to his command, requests for reinforcement, disputes over jurisdiction, petitions from newly compliant worlds seeking relief from harsh local conditions. He responded with energy that seemed boundless, striving to be fair, decisive, and worthy of the trust placed in him. To many, he appeared tireless, a figure shaped perfectly for the age of expansion. But even the strongest foundations can feel strain when stretched across a galaxy. The scale of the Imperium's growth meant that delays in communication were inevitable. Astropathic messages could be distorted by the warp, arriving incomplete or colored by emotional echoes. Decisions made in good faith sometimes rested on imperfect understanding. A governor judged too lenient might allow unrest to spread. Another, too severe, could spark the very rebellion he sought to prevent. Such outcomes were rarely traced back to a single moment, instead emerging slowly from chains of small misjudgments. Still, the prevailing narrative did not waver. Each challenge was framed as evidence of the Imperium's importance. Resistance proved that unity was necessary. Difficulties demonstrated the value of strong leadership. The Crusades' leaders believed history itself was on their side, that humanity's manifest destiny outweighed any local hardship or fleeting discord. Across countless systems, monuments were raised to commemorate compliance. Statues of the emperor stood in newly founded capitals, gazing eternally toward the stars. Beside them, likenesses of Primarchs and Astartes heroes reminded populations of the price paid for unity. Generations grew up knowing only the Imperium, their sense of identity tied not to a single world, but to a species spanning empires still in the making. And yet, for all its power and promise, the Imperium remained a creation in motion, its foundation still settling even as new heights were added. The Great Crusade had not paused long enough to examine the ground beneath its feet. Momentum carried it forward, brilliant and unstoppable, while behind the shining banners and triumphant reports, faint echoes of strain traveled quietly through the vast and growing realm of mankind. In the widening sphere of the Imperium, distance became more than a measure of space. It grew into a quiet force of its own, shaping decisions, tempering loyalties, and altering perceptions in ways too gradual to be easily seen. At the height of the Great Crusade, fleets could spend years beyond the reach of direct contact with terror. Even with astropathic choirs relaying messages across the void, communication was never instant, never perfect. Words carried through the warp were shaped by the minds that sent them and the tides they passed through. Meaning could blur. Urgency could distort. Silence, at times, lasted longer than any commander found comfortable. For the Primarchs, this distance was a test of interpretation. Each had been created with a fragment of the Emperor's grand design embodied within them, yet no two expressed that inheritance in the same way. In the Emperor's presence, differences blended into a unified purpose. In his absence, individuality sharpened. What one Primarch saw as necessary ruthlessness, another might view as excess. What one deemed patient strategy, another might condemn as hesitation. These differences did not erupt into open conflict. Not yet. Instead, they settled into patterns of quiet divergence, shaping how each legion prosecuted the crusade. Over time, these patterns became expectations. Worlds learned to associate certain legions with particular fates. Swift decapitation strikes, drawn-out sieges, cultural assimilation, or uncompromising annihilation of resistance. To imperial planners, this variety was strength. Specialized tools for specialized problems. Yet tools, once set in motion, often follow their own momentum. A legion accustomed to overwhelming force might be slower to attempt diplomacy. One known for patient integration might underestimate the speed at which rebellion could spread. The scale of the crusade left little room to reassess these tendencies once they took hold. Among ordinary humans serving within the fleets, perceptions shifted as well. Remembrances, tasked with recording the Crusade's triumphs, sometimes struggled to reconcile the official narrative of liberation with the harsher realities they witnessed. Iterators, preaching the imperial truth, encountered cultures whose beliefs could not be erased as easily as statues. Administrators balancing quotas and supply demands found themselves forced to make decisions that favored efficiency over empathy. None of this was considered failure. It was seen as the unavoidable friction of progress. The Imperium was building a future meant to last a millennia. Short-term discomfort was judged a tolerable cost. This belief, repeated often enough, became a shield against doubt. Horus, bearing the title of Warmaster, felt the effects of distance in subtler ways. Reports reached him filtered through layers of command, each adding perspective, each omitting detail. He trusted his brothers, yet he also knew that pride and pressure shaped their accounts. Victories were highlighted. Complications were summarized. Rarely did a message capture the full human cost of compliance on a troubled world. He compensated by traveling constantly, appearing where fighting was fiercest or negotiations most delicate. His presence reassured allies and overawed adversaries. To the Astartes, he remained a model of what a Primarch should be: decisive, courageous, and attentive to those under his command. But even he could not be everywhere. For every war zone he visited, a dozen more unfolded beyond his sight. Meanwhile, Terra grew more distant in memory as well as space. For many born on newly compliant worlds, the throne world was an abstraction, a symbol rather than a lived reality. Their loyalty was to the Imperium as an idea, vast, ordered, unstoppable. The Emperor was revered, but remote, known through iconography and doctrine more than presence. In this, a subtle transformation took place. Devotion shifted from a living leader to the institutions built in his name. Institutions, unlike individuals, do not tire or question. They expand according to their own logic. Bureaucracies multiplied to manage the flood of new systems. Regulations standardized everything from tithe grades to architectural templates. Efficiency improved, but flexibility diminished. Local variations that did not fit imperial models were gradually worn away, sometimes gently, sometimes by decree. From orbit, the Imperium still looked like a miracle unfolding, a species uniting after ages of division. Trade routes shimmered across star charts. Forge worlds glowed with industry. Naval patrols brought a measure of safety to regions long plagued by piracy and Xenos predation. To most observers, the trajectory remained upward, the future bright and assured. Yet progress, when measured only in expansion, can conceal the cost of speed. Foundations laid in haste may hold for a time, supported by momentum and belief. Cracks, if they form, do so quietly, hidden behind banners and celebrations. Few during the height of the Crusade had reason to look for such fractures. Fewer still wished to slow the advance long enough to search. So the fleets continued outward, their prows aimed at ever more distant stars. Behind them trailed worlds bound together by law, trade, and shared identity, yet separated by experience and memory. The Imperium was vast, powerful, and certain of its purpose, moving forward with a confidence that left little space for doubt, and even less of the possibility that distance itself might one day prove to be its greatest and most silent adversary. By the middle years of the Great Crusade, victory had become so constant that it took on the quality of routine. Expeditionary fleets translated from the warp, assessed local resistance, and executed compliance with a practiced efficiency that seemed to confirm the inevitability of humanity's dominion. What had once been legendary achievements now blended into a steady procession of successes, each impressive, each swiftly surpassed by the next. This atmosphere of unbroken momentum shaped the psychology of the Imperium as surely as any decree from Terra. Commanders planned not for whether they would prevail, but for how quickly. Administrators calculated the integration of future worlds before their fleets had even made contact. The language of uncertainty faded from official discourse, replaced by projections, timetables, and the assumption that expansion would continue without meaningful interruption. Among the legions of Astartes, this confidence deepened into identity. Entire generations of warriors knew only advance and conquest. Their training, already severe, was reinforced by lived experience that told them defeat was an aberration, something that happened in distant history or to lesser beings. Campaign honors accumulated. Battle doctrines hardened. Each legion's sense of itself as an indispensable instrument of destiny grew stronger with every compliant system added to the Imperium's maps. The Primarchs, too, were shaped by this era of relentless achievement. Celebrated across 1 million data feeds and remembrance chronicles, they became living symbols of triumph. Their words carried immense authority not only because of their origins, but because their record appeared flawless. When they spoke of strategy, unity, or sacrifice, few questioned them. Success had become its own proof. Horus, at the center of this expanding legend, found his role subtly transformed. Once first among equals in battle, he was now also the axis around which expectation turned. Every major victory reinforced the belief that his leadership guaranteed continued progress. Every resolved dispute between legions strengthened the perception that he alone could hold the vast war effort together. Praise followed him from system to system, sincere and fervent. Yet praise can be as heavy as criticism. The more the Imperium relied upon Horus as Warmaster, the more isolated his position became. Few could speak to him as a simple brother or comrade any longer. Even among his fellow Primarchs, conversations were increasingly colored by rank and responsibility. Deference, though offered with respect, created a subtle distance that neither ceremony nor shared history could entirely erase. On the worlds already brought into compliance, the effects of constant expansion were felt in different ways. Resources flowed outward to fuel new campaigns, regiments tied, materials requisitioned, ships constructed and dispatched. For many systems, participation in the crusade became a defining duty. Pride in contributing to humanity's destiny coexisted with a strain of meeting ever-growing demands. Imperial officials assured planetary leaders that such sacrifices were temporary, necessary steps toward a stable, unified future. In many places, this promise held true. Trade increased. Technology spread. Once isolated populations gained access to knowledge and protection unimaginable in earlier ages. These tangible benefits reinforced loyalty and masked the slower accumulation of fatigue beneath the surface. Culturally, the imperial truth continued its steady advance. Temples and shrines from older belief systems were repurposed as administrative centers or educational halls. Public ceremonies celebrated reason, progress, and the authority of the Imperium rather than local traditions. A generation was coming of age that had never known a time before compliance, for whom the Imperium was not an invader, but the natural order of things. Still, beneath this outward harmony, subtle contradictions endured. The Imperium preached the equality of humanity under a shared destiny, yet power was concentrated in distant institutions and transhuman warriors beyond ordinary comprehension. It celebrated rationality, yet depended on navigators who peered into a realm that defied reason, and astropaths whose minds bridged impossible distances at great personal cost. These tensions were accepted as practical necessities, rarely examined too closely. The scale of the crusade made reflection difficult. There was always another frontier, another system awaiting illumination. To pause too long on inconsistencies risked slowing the advance, and slowing the advance was unthinkable. Momentum had become both method and justification. So the Imperium surged forward, radiant in its belief that history had chosen this moment, this generation, to secure humanity's eternal future. Triumph followed triumph, each one reinforcing conviction that no force in the galaxy could truly threaten what had been built. The stars seemed to yield, one by one, to human will. And in that long season of victories without apparent end, the Imperium grew accustomed to the idea that its ascent was permanent, a certainty as vast and unquestioned as the void through which its fleets endlessly sailed. In the luminous decades of the Great Crusade, the Imperium came to believe not only in its strength, but in the inevitability of its righteousness. This belief was not enforced by fear alone, nor by propaganda in the crude sense, but by the steady accumulation of visible achievements. Every newly compliant world, every secured trade route, every extinguished threat seemed confirmed that humanity's dominion over the stars was both natural and just. Such certainty shaped institutions as surely as it shaped minds. Strategic projections no longer asked whether expansion should continue, but how far and how fast it could proceed. Fleets were organized around future campaigns that existed only as coordinates on distant charts. Shipyards labored without pause, their output calculated against conquests not yet begun. The Imperium's gaze was fixed perpetually forward, rarely turning back to examine what had already been built. For those who lived within this vast enterprise, the sense of participating in history was intoxicating. Soldiers of the Imperial Army spoke of their service as a contribution to an age that will be remembered for all time. Iterators traveled from world to world with the conviction that they were carrying enlightenment into darkness. Even civilian laborers, forging weapons or assembling void ships, were told that their work formed part of a grand design stretching across the galaxy. The Astartes Legions embodied this dream at its most intense. Engineered for war and raised amid constant victory, they saw themselves as a cutting edge of human destiny. To them, doubt was not merely weakness, but an obstacle to be overcome through discipline and loyalty. Campaign after campaign reinforced the lesson that their purpose was clear and their success assured. The idea that the crusade itself might one day fall to remain distant, almost unthinkable. Yet perfection, when assumed, leaves little room for self-correction. On some worlds, compliance had been achieved so swiftly that little thought was given to long-term governance. Garrisons were left small, their presence symbolic rather than sufficient. Administrators rotated frequently, unfamiliar with local histories and customs. Minor grievances, dismissed as temporary, sometimes deepened in the absence of careful attention. These were not crises, merely quiet imbalances, easy to overlook amid the vastness of the Imperium's concerns. Horus, burdened by command, sensed the growing complexity but trusted in the resilience of the system he helped guide. He believed, as many did, that temporary instability would settle as imperial structures matured. His focus remained on the frontier, where visible threats still required decisive action. There, his strengths were undeniable, and there, the narrative of constant triumph continued unchallenged. Meanwhile, the Emperor's work on Terra remained shrouded in secrecy. Rumors circulated among senior officials and Primarchs alike, fragments of speculation about projects of immense importance. Some believed he labored on a means to free humanity from reliance on the warp. Others thought he prepared defenses against dangers not yet revealed. Whatever the truth, his absence took on a new character, not merely distant, but deliberately withdrawn. This silence left space for interpretation. Without clear knowledge of the Emperor's immediate intentions, his sons and servants relied on their understanding of his long-term vision. Each believed they acted in accordance with his will. Each interpreted that will through the lens of personal experience and responsibility. So long as victory continued, these interpretations appeared aligned. Across the Imperium, monuments to unity rose ever higher. Starports bustled where wilderness had once reigned. Data networks linked systems that had not known one another's existence a generation before. The evidence of progress was undeniable, visible in steel, light, and ordered skies. To question the direction of such a civilization seemed almost irrational. And yet, like a structure built under perfect weather, the Imperium had not yet been tested by sustained internal strain. Its strength was proven in conquest, in overcoming external foes. Its cohesion, however, depended on shared belief, on trust in distant authorities, and on the assumption that the path ahead remained as clear as the one already traveled. In these years, that assumption held firm. The dream of united humanity, guided by reason and protected by unmatched might, shone with a brilliance that seemed immune to shadow. Few paused to wonder what might happen if that light were ever dimmed, or whether the weight of such a perfect dream might itself become a burden too great for any empire to bear. As the Great Crusade pressed onward, the Imperium entered a phase where its greatest challenges no longer came from obvious enemies, but from the quiet complexity of its own vastness. External threats still existed, alien empires, human tyrannies, the unpredictable hazards of the warp, yet these were familiar problems, met with familiar tools. What grew more difficult to confront were the subtle tensions forming within the very structure of the expanding realm. Each newly compliant world added not only resources and manpower, but history, culture, and expectation. Though the imperial truth sought to standardize belief and purpose, older identities did not vanish overnight. Beneath the surface of unity, countless local traditions persisted, reshaped rather than erased. Most caused no disruption, blending gradually into imperial norms. Some, however, clung to ideas that sat uneasily beside the doctrines of reason and secular authority. Imperial administrators, tasked with managing entire systems, could not always distinguish between harmless custom and potential unrest. Policies designed for efficiency sometimes pressed too hard on delicate social balances. A tax increase here, a forced restructuring there, might appear minor in isolation, yet together they altered the relationship between center and frontier. Compliance ensured obedience, but not always trust. Within the military arms of the Imperium, similar pressures emerged. The Imperial Army, drawn from countless worlds, reflected the diversity of the realm it served. Regiments differed in language, tradition, and tactical preference. While unified under common command, they did not always share the same understanding of what the Imperium represented. For some, it was a liberator. For others, a distant authority demanding endless sacrifice. The Astartes Legions remained more cohesive, bound by gene seed and shared purpose, yet even they were not immune to the slow shaping force of prolonged war. Campaign after campaign hardened attitudes. Mercy, once a strategic option, became rarer in legions that faced constant resistance. In others, prolonged governance duties fostered a growing sense of responsibility that blurred the line between warrior and ruler. These differences were subtle, but they marked diverging powers. Horus observed these developments with a commander's pragmatism. Variation, he believed, was inevitable in an enterprise of such scale. What mattered was that all forces continued to move toward the same ultimate goal, a unified, stable Imperium. He trusted in loyalty, in shared origins, and in the bonds forged through years of cooperation. To him, the Crusade diversity remained a strength, not a warning. Yet even as he held this faith, the demands upon him multiplied. Petitions from governors, appeals from generals, and disputes between branches of the imperial machine filled his councils. Each issue, on its own, seemed manageable. Together, they formed a constant tide of responsibility that left little room for rest or reflection. The Warmaster's role had become not only military, but administrative and symbolic, a burden without clear boundary. Far away on Terra, the Emperor's silence endured. His grand design continued unseen, its details known only to a select few. For the wider Imperium, this absence grew increasingly abstract. Loyalty to him remained absolute, yet it was expressed through systems, laws, and institutions that operated without his visible hand. The Imperium functioned, expanded, and enforced its will largely through momentum. So the great project advanced, magnificent and immense, its surface bright with achievement. Beneath that brilliance, however, lay countless small stresses, cultural, political, and personal. None yet threatened the whole. None were widely recognized as significant, but like faint lines in stone long before a fracture forms, they marked places where pressure gathered, waiting for a moment when the weight of an empire might finally bear down upon them. By the time the Great Crusade had spanned a generation, a subtle transformation had taken place within the Imperium's collective mind. What had once been an extraordinary campaign of reunification had become the accepted state of existence. Expansion was no longer seen as an effort requiring constant vigilance, but as a natural condition, as steady and unquestioned as the rising of a distant star. This shift was not proclaimed in any decree. It emerged quietly, shaped by repetition. Victory followed victory. Systems were integrated. Trade routes stabilized. Over time, the idea that the Imperium might ever cease advancing began to feel implausible. Momentum created its own sense of permanence, and permanence bred a quiet relaxation of caution. In the earliest days of the Crusade, each compliance action had been treated as a singular challenge. Commanders studied cultures carefully, weighing the risks of diplomacy or war. Fleets moved with deliberate coordination, aware that setbacks could stall progress across entire regions. But as success accumulated, urgency gave way to assumption. Plans were made further in advance, based on expectations shaped more by recent triumphs than by sober analysis. The Imperium had not grown careless in the simple sense. Its fleets were still disciplined. Its legions remained formidable. Rather, a deeper kind of complacency had taken root. The belief that the structure being built was inherently stable, that its foundations were beyond serious threat. Few stopped to ask whether unity imposed at great speed could endure without equal attention to understanding. On many worlds, life under imperial rule settled into patterns that seemed to confirm this confidence. Starports thrived. Data archives expanded. Generations grew up learning of Terra not as a distant conqueror, but as the heart of a civilization to which they naturally belonged. Children studied the Primarchs as figures of history even while those beings still walked among the stars. The extraordinary had become familiar. This normalization extended to the legions themselves. Warriors who had once felt like pioneers on the edge of the unknown now operated as instruments of an established order. Their presence signaled not the arrival of a fragile hope, but the enforcement of a certainty. Campaigns were executed with precision born of experience, yet the sense of wonder that had accompanied the earliest reunifications faded into disciplined routine. Horus observed this evolution with measured approval. Stability, after all, was the goal of the Crusade. The less extraordinary the Imperium felt, the more successful its unification had been. Worlds that saw imperial governance as normal rather than imposed were less likely to rebel. From a strategic perspective, the shift appeared to validate every sacrifice made along the way. And yet, the Warmaster also sensed a quiet change in the emotional tone of the Crusade. Where once there had been urgency fueled by uncertainty, there was now expectation. Success was assumed before it was earned. Difficulties were interpreted as temporary delays rather than meaningful warnings. The possibility that a campaign might reveal limits rather than extend boundaries was rarely entertained. Distance amplified this illusion. With the Emperor absent from daily command, his grand design became an abstraction shaped by interpretation. His sons and servants acted with sincere belief in their understanding of his will, Yet that understanding rested increasingly on memory and inference rather than direct guidance. Over time, interpretation hardened into conviction, and conviction resisted revision. Meanwhile, the Imperium's sheer size made oversight ever more difficult. Entire sectors functioned for years with minimal direct contact from central authorities. Local solutions became standard practice, some wise, others flawed. Most were never examined closely, because the greater machine continued to move forward, its outward progress masking the unevenness within. The result was an empire that looked unshakable from a distance. Star maps glowed with imperial markers. Supply convoys crossed vast regions without interruption. Astropathic choirs sang a coordination across impossible gulfs. To any observer measuring strength in territory and fleets, humanity's dominion appeared secure beyond question. Yet permanence, when assumed rather than tested, is a fragile thing. The Imperium's unity depended not only on power, but on shared understanding, trust in distant leadership, and belief in a common future. These were living bonds, requiring care and renewal. Left unattended, even the strongest ties could fray, not through dramatic rupture, but through gradual neglect. Still, in this era of radiance, such concerns drifted at the edges of thought, easily dismissed in the glow of constant achievement. The Imperium moved forward with calm assurance, certain that what had been built would endure unchanged, as though history itself had paused to admire the vast and shining permanence of mankind's ascendant empire. As the Imperium's borders pushed ever outward, the true challenge of its existence became not conquest, but scale. What had once been a grand campaign now resembled a permanent state of expansion, an empire growing faster than its own understanding of itself. Distance was measured not only in light years, but in layers of command, interpretation, and assumption. From Terra, the Imperium could still be imagined as a unified whole, its domains linked by purpose and law. From the frontier, however, unity often felt abstract. Worlds newly brought into compliance saw only the fleets above them, the officials who followed, and the distant authority whose presence was conveyed through symbols rather than personal contact. Loyalty was pledged sincerely, yet it was loyalty to an idea that few could fully grasp. Administrators worked tirelessly to bridge these gaps. Census records, tithe assessments, and cultural surveys flowed towards sector capitals in endless streams of data. Patterns were charted, projections calculated. The Imperium believed that through sufficient organization, any challenge of scale could be mastered. Complexity was met with bureaucracy, distance with procedure. For a time, this approach seemed to succeed. Supply lines functioned across staggering distances. Reinforcements reached war zones in time to matter. Whole regions were pacified and integrated without requiring the presence of a Primarch or even a legion. The system appeared to justify itself, each solved problem reinforcing confidence in the machinery of empire. Yet systems, however efficient, cannot fully account for the unpredictability of human experience. On isolated worlds, local conditions shaped imperial rule in ways far removed from original intent. A governor's temperament might determine whether compliance felt like partnership or occupation. A single misjudged decree could shift public sentiment for decades. Such nuances rarely survived the journey back through layers of reporting. The legions, too, felt the strain of scale. Spread across countless war zones, they operated with increasing autonomy. This independence was necessary. No central command could micromanage campaigns across the galaxy. But autonomy encouraged distinct cultures within each legion to deepen further. Customs became doctrines. Doctrines became identity. Identity, over time, shaped interpretation of orders. Horus remained a point where all these threads converged. His councils were filled with maps dense with markers, each representing a theater of war, a rebellious system, or a petition for aid. He moved from decision to decision with relentless focus, aware that delay in one region could ripple outward in unforeseen ways. To those around him, he appeared the embodiment of control, holding the vast enterprise together through will alone. Privately, he understood that control was never complete. The Imperium's reach now exceeded the grasp of any single mind, even his own. He relied on trust, in his brothers, in his commanders, in the structures built under the Emperor's guidance. Trust allowed the crusade to function. Without it, paralysis would follow. Across the Imperium, ordinary citizens rarely perceived this delicate balance. They saw starships arriving on schedule, goods flowing through markets, and news of victories carried by astropathic relay. To them, the Empire felt stable, permanent, guided by powers far beyond local uncertainty. The immense effort required to maintain that stability remained largely invisible. This invisibility fostered a dangerous illusion that the Imperium cohesion was effortless, a natural state rather than a constant achievement. When challenges did arise, they were viewed as anomalies rather than symptoms. A rebellion was blamed on a single corrupt official, not on systemic overreach. A delayed supply convoy was attributed to navigational error, not to the strain of maintaining routes across impossible distances. None of this suggested imminent collapse. The Imperium was still strong, its armies vast, its leaders determined. But the margin for error narrowed as scale increased. Small miscalculations carried wider consequences. Delays multiplied. Misunderstandings lingered longer before correction. The system endured, yet it did so under growing, largely unacknowledged pressure. In these years, the Imperium stood at the height of its apparent power, its expansion unbroken, its confidence unwavering. But like a structure extended beyond its original design, its strength depended increasingly on balance, trust, and the assumption that tomorrow would resemble today. Few considered how quickly that assumption could be tested, or how shadows cast by sheer scale might one day stretch farther than any fleet could easily reach. By the time the Great Crusade had reached the midpoint of its second generation, the Imperium had become a machine of remarkable complexity, vast beyond comprehension, and yet sustained almost entirely through the diligence, loyalty, and faith of its human participants. Fleets numbered in the thousands, star systems counted in the tens of thousands, and yet the human element remained the engine of this relentless expansion. Machines could organize, calculate, and execute orders, but the Imperium relied on living mind to interpret the will of command, enforce policy, and make decisions in the absence of certainty. For Horus, Warmaster of the Imperium, this created a unique tension. From his flagship, he could observe the movements of entire fleets, track campaigns unfolding across sectors, and issue directives that rippled through space like the sound of distant thunder. Yet with every order sent, he had to rely on the competence and judgment of those hundreds or thousands of leagues away who received it. Delay, misinterpretation, or unforeseen circumstance could turn a simple campaign into an extended struggle. His mind, vast though it was, could not be in every council chamber, every forward command post, or every garrison city. The distance between intention and execution became an invisible weight upon him. Every successful campaign reinforced the sense that the Imperium was infallible, yet every minor failure reminded him that fallibility remained a constant, subtle companion. A planet pacified might flourish under imperial administration, or might, without oversight, breed resentment beneath the surface. Supply chains could falter, astropathic messages might be delayed or distorted by the turbulence of the warp, and even loyal commanders could act according to interpretations that diverged from original intent. Each minor imperfection multiplied as it passed through the chain of command. Meanwhile, the Astartes Legions, though genetically engineered and rigorously trained, had grown accustomed to autonomy. They were capable of making decisions on the scale of worlds and systems, yet independence came with a quiet danger of divergence. Each legion had developed its own traditions, methods, and priorities. What one considered appropriate conduct, another might view as lax or excessive. Though unity remained, subtle distinctions began to mark the character of each legion, shaping their approach to both compliance and governance. Even within the Primarchs, variations emerged. Differences of philosophy, temperament, and personal experience informed judgment. Some prioritized efficiency, others valor. Some embraced diplomacy, others favored overwhelming force. All believed they served the Emperor and the goals of the Crusade, yet interpretation now played a larger role than direct guidance. Where once certainty had been immediate and absolute, it was now filtered through the lens of personality and context. This created a network of authority both strong and fragile, capable of remarkable accomplishment but dependent upon careful balance. Across the vast domains of the Imperium, ordinary humans participated without fully perceiving this fragility. Citizens on newly compliant worlds observed fleets passing through orbit, administrators implementing laws, and supply convoys arriving with regularity. To them, the Imperium appeared permanent, omnipresent, and unshakable. They did not see the thousands of minor decisions, the countless judgments, and the subtle negotiations that preserved order across countless parsecs of space. They experienced only the outcome, a galaxy structured, maintained, and defended in the Emperor's name. This omnipresence was both a triumph and a burden. It created a civilization capable of remarkable coordination, yet one in which any break in attention could have unforeseen consequences. Fleets could enforce compliance, yet culture, loyalty, and belief required constant cultivation. Each system was a node in a living network. Neglect one node, and its influence could ripple outward, imperceptible at first, until disruption emerged where least expected. For Horus, these truths were never theoretical. Every campaign brought reports of minor disturbances, a planetary governor resisting policy, a regiment struggling with logistics, or a newly compliant world quietly pushing back against standardized practices. None warranted alarm, yet each reminded him that authority had limits, that even the most disciplined system contained moving parts beyond immediate control. His presence, though vast in influence, could not extend everywhere simultaneously, and he bore the awareness that the weight of the Imperium rested upon him even as its reality depended upon countless hands and minds beyond his reach. Even as fleets pressed forward, bringing the Imperium to new stars, the distance between command and execution quietly expanded. Orders passed through layers of interpretation, each step subtly reshaping intent. Autonomy strengthened loyalty and initiative, but it also magnified the possibility of divergence. The Imperium moved like a living organism, coordinated, efficient, and powerful, yet subject to the limits of those whose care it relied upon. And so, in the era of radiant triumph, the Imperium became a civilization both vast and delicately balanced. Success had become routine, yet it existed only because countless unseen judgments aligned with the Emperor's design. Victory depended on the competence of the many as much as the authority of the few. In this, the Great Crusade revealed a truth quietly persistent beneath all grandeur. Omnipresence in theory was infinite, yet in practice it was always imperfect, bound by distance, interpretation, and the enduring humanity of those who carried the empire forward. The stars continued to shine across the void. Fleets moved from system to system, and on the bridge of his flagship, Horus watched the galaxies unfold, aware that even in this moment of unparalleled achievement, the delicate weight of command pressed upon him like a shadow stretching across light itself. As the Imperium pressed ever farther into the galaxy, the vastness of its dominion began to reveal effects that no single calculation could fully anticipate. The Great Crusade had long depended on the combination of overwhelming force and careful administration, yet even the most disciplined systems began to show signs of strain under the sheer weight of distance, scale, and expectation. Small deviations accumulated quietly, often invisible to those who had never left Terra or the central sectors, but nevertheless shaping outcomes in subtle ways. For the legions of Astartes, prolonged campaigns imposed a different kind of stress. Generations of warriors, trained for war and bred for loyalty, became accustomed to absolute success. Each victory reinforced confidence. Each compliance reinforced belief in the inevitability of the Imperium's advance. Yet repeated campaigns in diverse and distant environments introduced complexities that no doctrine could fully capture. Adaptive strategies became necessary, and small disagreements over the application of authority occasionally flared within Legion command structures, resolved swiftly but leaving faint echoes in memory. Primarchs observed these pressures differently, shaped by temperament and method. Some approached them analytically, adjusting deployment, supply, and strategy to minimize friction. Others relied on personal authority and example, moving decisively to impose cohesion wherever divergence arose. In all cases, they recognized that the Imperium's outward appearance of perfection masked a reality of subtle imbalance, a system held together by discipline, judgment, and faith rather than any inherent inevitability. Horus, as Warmaster, felt the imperceptible weight of this reality more acutely than most. Command stretched across thousands of light-years, every decision cascading through layers of subordinates whose own interpretation shaped implementation. Minor misunderstandings, deferred decisions, or delayed reinforcements could produce unintended consequences, and while most were manageable, the accumulation of such small errors created pressure that, though unseen, was persistent. He bore this responsibility with vigilance, yet knew that perfect control was impossible. The Imperium's success relied as much on trust in others as on his own authority. On newly integrated worlds, the consequences of subtle fracture were even less visible. Administrators rotated frequently, leaving local populations to adapt to systems they scarcely understood. Taxation, resource allocation, and cultural directives often collided with existing practices, generating minor but persistent dissatisfaction. Reports of unrest were sometimes delayed, filtered through astropathic networks, or softened by officials eager to preserve the impression of stability. Thus, the Imperium's outward triumph often concealed nuanced tension beneath its surface. Even ordinary citizens contributed unknowingly to this delicate balance. Laborers in shipyards, artisans in colony cities, and farmers on distant worlds all relied upon the coherence of governance and supply. Their compliance, their productivity, and their belief in the Imperium reinforced an illusion of stability. Yet the farther removed they were from Terra, the more fragile that alignment became, dependent on a chain of decisions stretching across countless intermediaries. Among the legions, the effects of subtle divergence were amplified by identity. Each legion had developed its own methods, traditions, and approaches of compliance. What one considered acceptable discipline, another might see as overreach. Autonomy fostered creativity and initiative, but introduced variation that could be difficult to reconcile with imperial doctrine. Horus maintained cohesion through councils, direct intervention when necessary, and the cultivation of shared purpose, but even he could not witness every action taken in the name of the Emperor. The Emperor's silence, ongoing since his return to Terra, amplified the weight of responsibility carried by the Warmaster and his brothers. Without daily guidance, they interpreted the grand design in ways shaped by experience, temperament, and circumstance. Their interpretations were sincere, even devout, yet subtle deviations naturally arose, accumulating across sectors and legions with each passing year. Even the most minor fissures had the potential to ripple outward. A mismanaged planet could produce unrest that required legion intervention. Delayed fleets or misinterpreted orders could cascade into tactical recalibration across entire systems. Small errors, multiplied across thousands of worlds and hundreds of campaigns, became challenges that could not be resolved by force alone. They required foresight, judgment, and a continual balance between discipline and flexibility. In this context, the Imperium's triumph remained undeniable, yet the very mechanisms that produced victory revealed the first traces of imperfection. Its vastness created efficiency, but also fragility. Its reliance on order produced coherence, yet also dependency. Even in the era of relentless expansion and apparent perfection, the seeds of subtle fracture existed within every chain of command, every administrative network, and every human heart entrusted with the weight of compliance. And so, as fleets continued to traverse the stars and new worlds were brought into the growing dominion of the Imperium, a quiet truth became apparent. The outward shine of progress and unity could never fully conceal the delicate tensions that maintained it. Victory was constant, discipline unbroken, and loyalty profound. Yet beneath the surface, the first faint cracks of an imperceptible strain stretched across the galaxy, invisible to most, yet shaping the future in ways that only time would reveal. By the midpoint of the Great Crusade, the Imperium's reach had become immense, its influence felt across countless star systems. Worlds once isolated or fragmented had been drawn into a single framework, their populations educated in the imperial truth, their leaders subordinated to laws and directives conceived on Terra and enforced by fleets and legions alike. The velocity of expansion created a sense that humanity's destiny was already secured, and yet this very certainty carried hidden costs, subtle pressures that would shape the future in ways few could yet perceive. For the legions of Astartes, the pattern of relentless victories reinforced their sense of purpose. Generations of warriors were trained to expect success, to anticipate obedience from the worlds they brought into compliance, and to execute orders with precision. Each campaign honed skills, each conquest solidified identity, and each system integrated into the Imperium reinforced the notion that humanity's dominion over the stars was not only possible but inevitable. This expectation, however, carried with it a quiet danger, an over-reliance on the predictability of obedience and the assumption that compliance could be achieved without exception. Horus, as Warmaster, observed these dynamics closely. The burden of omnipresence weighed heavily upon him, as fleets spread farther than any single mind could monitor directly. His councils were filled with reports of minor disturbances, logistical delays, or governance issues, each requiring consideration, judgment, and sometimes decisive action. These tasks, while individually manageable, formed a relentless tide. The larger the Imperium grew, the more fragile its apparent stability became, dependent upon countless judgments made accurately and promptly at great remove from central authority. Even within the Primarchs Legions, subtle divergence was evident. Autonomy encouraged initiative, but it also created variation in doctrine and approach. Some legions enforced compliance with strict discipline and swift resolution. Others relied on persuasion, accommodation, and structured integration. While all shared loyalty to the Emperor and commitment to the Crusade, differences in temperament and method naturally amplified over time, introducing friction that required careful management at the highest levels. On compliant worlds, the price of certainty was even more tangible. Administrators implemented standardized systems of law, taxation, and infrastructure, often with little understanding of local culture or history. These systems functioned effectively, ensuring security and efficiency, yet they occasionally produced tension beneath the surface. Minor grievances could accumulate unnoticed, latent discontent forming in ways that were imperceptible at first, yet potent enough to disrupt stability if neglected. The Imperium, for all its might, depended upon continual vigilance to maintain cohesion. Ordinary citizens rarely perceived these pressures. They witnessed fleets arriving on schedule, markets functioning efficiently, and the Astartes patrolling the skies. To them, the Imperium was perfect, constant, and unyielding. The mechanisms that produced this order, the countless judgments, subtle interventions, and adjustments made by distant officials and commanders, remained invisible. Their lives reflected the success of a system maintained with precision, yet the human labor and care required to sustain it were largely hidden from view. Horus understood the tension inherent in such perfection. Expansion and integration required certainty, yet certainty could encourage complacency. Leaders could assume that structures were unassailable, that compliance was permanent, and that the Imperium's momentum would endure without constant attention. In reality, every system, every chain of command, and every fleet was a node in a living network, subject to the imperfections of human judgment, miscommunication, and the subtle pressures imposed by scale. Distance further complicated matters. Astropathic messages and warp travel connected worlds across light years, yet communication was never perfect. Reports arrived incomplete, filtered through layers of command, or delayed by turbulence in the warp. The farther a world lay from central authority, the more interpretation replaced certainty, and the more autonomous decision-making carried weight equal to, or sometimes greater than, orders issued from terror. Even the Emperor's silence amplified these dynamics. With the source of ultimate authority withdrawn from daily governance, his sons and agents interpreted his vision to the best of their ability. These interpretations were sincere, faithful, and often extraordinarily effective, yet variation and divergence were unavoidable. The system functioned brilliantly, but the machinery of command was human at its core, and humanity is never without imperfection. In this era of apparent perfection, the Imperium became both invincible and vulnerable, its outward shine concealing the quiet tensions beneath. Success reinforced expectation. Expectation masked fragility, and the very certainty of triumph introduced its own subtle costs, reliance on momentum, trust in distant subordinates, and faith in the permanence of compliance. Each of these would shape the Imperium's path, influencing the events yet to come in ways no observer could yet measure. And so the galaxy expanded under human dominion, brilliant in its order, vast in its reach, and steady in its apparent perfection. Yet beneath the banners, within the councils, and across the distant star systems, subtle pressures accumulated. The price of certainty was invisibility, an unseen weight borne quietly by leaders and soldiers alike, the consequences of which would echo through the centuries to follow, shaping the fate of mankind even as the Imperium appeared at the height of its radiant, unbroken triumph. As the Great Crusade progressed into its later decades, the Imperium had achieved a scale and cohesion unmatched in the history of humanity. Star systems counted by the thousands were bound under the same law, sharing trade, communication networks, and common defense. The rhythm of expansion, now measured not in months but in light years, created an outward impression of unbroken success. Yet beneath this calm, subtle complexities had begun to emerge, dynamics that could not be fully managed from any single vantage point, no matter how vigilant the Warmaster or his Primarchs. Horus, ever mindful of the immense responsibilities resting upon his shoulders, perceived these subtleties with a clarity born of experience. He understood that success on one front did not guarantee harmony elsewhere. Each world carried its own history, culture, and expectation, and though most had adapted to the Imperium's guidance, some retained latent discontent. Small deviations in governance, minor administrative errors, or simple misunderstandings could create friction that multiplied as it passed through bureaucracies, astropathic relays, and the judgments of countless officials and officers. The legions of Astartes were not immune to these pressures. Decades of constant campaigns and victories had honed their skill and reinforced their sense of purpose, yet autonomy, while necessary, had introduced diversity in methods and philosophy. Each legion's operational style, discipline, and interpretation of orders now bore the imprint of long experience and repeated successes. Though these differences had rarely produced open conflict, they required careful management to ensure cohesion and prevent misunderstandings from escalating in unforeseen ways. Among the Primarchs, subtle divergence also grew. Though united in their loyalty to the Emperor and the goals of the Crusade, each had its own perspective on strategy, governance, and the application of force. Differences that might have been insignificant in smaller campaigns now assumed greater consequence across entire sectors. Horus maintained contact through councils, correspondence, and occasional personal oversight, yet he recognized that even his presence could not reach every node of responsibility simultaneously. Success required trust as much as authority. On compliant worlds, the people themselves contributed to the delicate equilibrium. Generations had grown under the stability enforced by fleets and administrators, learning to navigate the balance between imperial law and local custom. Trade thrived. Industry expanded. Education and public works created the impression of a civilization advancing inexorably toward perfection. Yet beneath the surface, subtle tensions remained. Disputes between guilds, minor resistance to standardized law, and the persistence of cultural practices that had not been fully integrated into the imperial framework. These were rarely urgent, but cumulatively, they represented a quiet undercurrent running through the fabric of compliance. The Emperor's absence continued to shape all calculations. Commanders, governors, and Primarchs alike operated without his direct oversight, interpreting his vision and acting upon their understanding of his will. Their decisions were informed by experience, intuition, and loyalty, yet the lack of immediate guidance meant that subtle divergence could emerge over time. The Imperium functioned brilliantly, yet its perfection was provisional, maintained by countless human judgments rather than enforced by any single omnipresent hand. Even the most routine campaigns carried implications far beyond their immediate outcomes. Supply chains extended across thousands of light years, fleet rotations demanded precise coordination, and astropathic communication was always subject to delay or distortion by the warp. Minor miscalculations, easily corrected in isolation, could accumulate in distant sectors, producing unforeseen consequences. The scale of the Imperium, which had become its greatest strength, also imposed an invisible fragility. Horus's role, both practical and symbolic, became increasingly complex. He coordinated fleets, mediated disputes, and ensured that the momentum of the Crusade remained unbroken. He was a visible center of human expansion, yet he also understood that this power was inherently limited. No Primarch, no matter how capable, could fully oversee the galaxy in its entirety. The Imperium depended on loyalty, diligence, and judgment at every level, and while these qualities have been sufficient to date, the system's reliance on them remained an invisible risk. In the midst of unbroken victories and flourishing worlds, there was a growing sense, imperceptible to most, that the galaxy held more than what could be seen or measured. Unknown stars, uncharted systems, and phenomena beyond comprehension waited beyond the edge of mapped space. The Imperium advanced toward them with confidence, yet the vastness of the void implied that certainty itself was provisional, subject to forces that might one day challenge even the most disciplined campaigns. And so, in this period of radiant achievement, the Imperium continued to expand, calm and orderly on the surface, its fleets and fleets of warriors moving through the stars with practiced precision. Yet beneath the apparent perfection, subtle pressures accumulated, tensions between autonomy and unity, distance and oversight, trust and interpretation. Victory was constant, loyalty profound, and the Emperor's design revered, yet the Imperium remained a creation of motion and judgment, held together by human hands and minds. In the stillness of success, a quiet awareness lingered, An understanding that the galaxy's vastness carried mysteries yet to test even the brightest triumphs, and that the calm before the unknown stretched endlessly across the stars. As the Great Crusade approached the later decades of its first century, the Imperium had grown into a civilization of unprecedented scale. Systems were united under law, trade and communication flowed across hundreds of star systems, and fleets enforced compliance with unwavering precision. Yet as the Imperium expanded outward, a subtle tension began to emerge between the certainty of its power and the unknown challenges that lay beyond its current reach. The further its influence extended, the more the edges of certainty stretched, revealing the fragile limits of even its greatest strengths. For Horus, Warmaster of the Imperium, this tension was a constant consideration. His attention was divided across campaigns spanning thousands of light years, each with its own variables, uncertainties, and unexpected complications. While fleets could enforce compliance and legions could execute orders with precision, no strategy could fully eliminate the potential for misjudgment, delay, or miscommunication. Each campaign was a microcosm of the Imperium's broader challenges, immense, complex, and dependent upon countless individuals making correct decisions far from direct oversight. The Astartes Legions, forged for both war and leadership, operated as instruments of the Imperium's will. Their victories had become so consistent that success was often assumed before campaigns even began. Yet the very predictability of their methods introduced subtle risks. Legions that grew accustomed to absolute obedience and unbroken triumph were at times less attentive to nuance. Where diplomacy or cultural understanding was required, rigid expectations could lead to friction or misinterpretation. Autonomy ensured effectiveness but introduced a possibility of divergence. Primarchs, each a living embodiment of the Emperor's vision, recognized these dynamics differently. Some relied on strict adherence to standardized doctrine, ensuring consistent application across their commands. Others adapted their methods to local conditions, prioritizing understanding over expediency. Even when motivated by loyalty and devotion, these divergent approaches shaped the perception of imperial authority across systems. Success was maintained, yet the variation introduced a quiet undercurrent of unpredictability. On newly integrated worlds, the Imperium's presence was both stabilizing and transformative. Trade networks connected distant regions, infrastructure and technology uplifted populations, and imperial law imposed order where chaos had once reigned. Yet local histories and customs persisted, subtly resisting total assimilation. Administrators and governors worked tirelessly to maintain balance, yet even minor oversight could grow into persistent tension if unaddressed. The Imperium's triumph was thus not absolute. It existed alongside small, accumulating pressures that demanded continual attention. Distance magnified these complexities. Astropathic messages carried orders across the void, yet were subject to delay, interpretation, and corruption by warp currents. Fleets could move swiftly, but the sheer scale of the galaxy imposed limits on oversight. The farther a world or campaign lay from terror, the more decisions depended on judgment at a remove, and the more that judgment shaped outcomes independent of direct instruction. Trust became as essential as authority, and the possibility of error, though often minor, was a persistent shadow. Even the Emperor's absence from direct governance played a significant role. His vision guided the Imperium, yet interpretation of that vision increasingly rested on the experience, temperament, and conscience of his sons and agents. Decisions were sincere, deliberate, and aligned with purpose, yet subtle divergence was inevitable. The Imperium thrived on these judgments, yet relied upon them functioning correctly in an environment of vast distance, complex variables, and relentless expansion. The ordinary citizens of the Imperium perceived only the outward order and efficiency. They witnessed fleets passing overhead, markets functioning, and administrative systems operating with apparent perfection. The scale of success concealed the intricate network of judgment, oversight, and diligence upon which that order depended. Their loyalty and belief reinforced the illusion of stability, yet the very mechanisms that created it remained largely invisible. As the Crusade moved into increasingly uncharted regions, the limits of understanding became more apparent. Unmapped stars, unexamined anomalies, and phenomena beyond human comprehension awaited beyond the frontier. The Imperium's confidence remained high, yet the edges of certainty stretched ever outward, revealing the potential for challenges that could not be fully anticipated. Strength and organization were evident, but so too was a growing reliance on interpretation, judgment, and faith in distant subordinates. And so, in the midst of extraordinary success, the Imperium continued to expand, brilliant and unyielding on the surface, yet subtly aware of its own limits. Fleets moved through the stars, compliance spread across worlds, and the Astartes Legions executed campaigns with precision. Victory was constant, yet the universe beyond the edges of current knowledge remained a quiet, distant presence. The Imperium's triumph, vast and unbroken, carried with it the soft reminder that even the most certain empire exists within the boundaries of the unknown, and that the weight of expansion always presses upon the fragile balance of authority, judgment, and trust. By the 15th decade of the Great Crusade, the Imperium had achieved a scale and coherence that few in history could have imagined. Star systems glimmered with lights of compliance and order, fleets moved through the void with precise coordination, and planets once isolated or fragmented now shared governance, trade, and communication networks that tied them into a single, galaxy-spanning civilization. The triumph of humanity appeared permanent, radiant, and undeniable, a testament to the vision of the Emperor and the careful stewardship of his Primarchs, particularly Horus, the Warmaster. Yet beneath this brilliance, subtle tensions persisted. Expansion had reached a magnitude at which the smallest misalignment could ripple outward with unforeseen consequences. Every new world brought not only resources and strategic advantage, but the complexity of history, culture, and human expectation. Administrators and governors strove to balance these variables with efficiency, but distance and diversity made perfect uniformity impossible. The Imperium's outward perfection was maintained through diligence, judgment, and the extraordinary loyalty of those who acted in its name. Horus, charged with overseeing the Crusade's vast machinery, understood the delicate balance upon which the empire rested. He watched as legions of Astartes moved from system to system, executing campaigns with unbroken precision, yet he was ever aware that no fleet, no Primarch, and no council could fully supervise every action. Decisions made in isolation, even minor ones, could propagate through chains of command, subtly altering outcomes. Success, while constant, demanded continual attention. The Warmaster's role was as much about maintaining cohesion and trust as about planning strategy or leading battles. The legions themselves reflected the interplay of discipline and autonomy. Each had developed distinct traditions and operational methods through decades of independent campaigns. These differences rarely caused open conflict, yet they shaped interpretation and implementation of orders, creating a network of subtle variation across thousands of systems. Autonomy enabled adaptability, but it also introduced unpredictability, requiring oversight and guidance from those at the center of the crusade. Even the most loyal legions relied upon judgment, not mere obedience. On worlds newly brought into the Imperium's orbit, compliance was achieved through a combination of force, persuasion, and infrastructure. Civilizations were transformed, trade networks established, and populations educated in the principles of the imperial truth. Yet beneath outward stability, minor tensions lingered, unassimilated customs, resistance to imposed law, and latent frustration with distant governance. These were not crises in the ordinary sense, but they reflected the quiet complexity inherent in integrating countless diverse worlds into a single empire. Distance magnified these challenges. Astropathic communication, though swift relative to physical travel, remained subject to delay, distortion, and the turbulence of the warp. Fleet coordination required precise calculation and trust in subordinates far from direct oversight. Decisions that seemed simple in the short term could generate unforeseen consequences when transmitted across vast regions of space. The Imperium's strength depended on the competence of many, its unity on trust, and its cohesion on faith that distant leaders would act wisely. Even the Emperor's absence shaped this dynamic. His sons and agents interpreted his will through experience, conviction, and tradition. Their decisions were guided by loyalty, yet filtered through personal understanding. Variation was inevitable, yet the Imperium's outward success depended upon these judgments functioning harmoniously across thousands of worlds and countless campaigns. The machinery of the Crusade moved as if by design, yet its perfection existed only because of continuous vigilance. Ordinary citizens, soldiers, and administrators experienced the Imperium as constant and absolute. They saw fleets arrive on schedule, trade flow unbroken, and law maintained efficiently. The underlying network of human diligence, judgment, and oversight remained largely invisible, yet it was essential. The galaxy's order depended upon countless hands acting faithfully, often without recognition, across immense distances and under the shadow of uncertainty. The vastness of the Imperium, while a source of strength, also revealed the limits of certainty. Unknown systems, unmapped regions, and forces beyond comprehension lay at the edges of the Crusade, awaiting contact. The Imperium advanced with confidence, yet every campaign extended the frontier into realms where past experience provided only limited guidance. Momentum carried the Empire forward, but the universe beyond known space remained a quiet, ever-present variable. And so, in this era of brilliant triumph, the Imperium sailed across the stars, radiant and unbroken on the surface, yet balanced in the interplay of trust, judgment, and vigilance. Fleets moved with precision, compliance spread across worlds, and the Astartes Legions executed their campaigns with unyielding skill. Victory was continuous, loyalty unwavering, and the Emperor's vision revered. Yet even amidst this grandeur, the vast horizon beyond current knowledge hinted at challenges that could not be fully measured. The Imperium's radiance illuminated the stars, yet the void beyond remained patient and unknowable, waiting for the day when human certainty would be tested in ways that could not yet be imagined.